Joseph Goebbels, architect of Nazism, Führer for a day. The time was 3:15 p.m. on the 30th of April 1945, when those who were in the Reich Chancellery underground in central Berlin heard the shot. Silence followed, but the Nazi Minister for Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, knew what the sound had meant. The man he had called his leader for over 20 years, Adolf Hitler, was dead, and Goebbels was now the new leader or Führer of the Nazi Third Reich. A few days before taking his own life, Hitler had rewritten his last will and testament and promoted Goebbels to become his successor. What would he do? Above ground, the Soviet Red Army was tightening the noose on central Berlin, and to the west the British, French, Americans and other allies were fanning out all over Germany. In the end, Goebbels would soon follow Hitler's path and choose death over being captured. It was the end of a long time at the forefront of Nazism. This is the short story of the man who was Führer of Germany for just one day in 1945. The road to Nazism. Joseph Goebbels was born on the 29th of October 1897 in the city of Mönchengladbach in the Rhineland region of the far west of what was then the German Empire. He grew up here in a normal middle-class family. Joseph suffered from a disability from his youth. Owing to a congenital health condition, his right foot turned inwards and was shorter than his left foot. His health was also poor in other ways. For instance, he suffered from a respiratory condition. All of this meant that when the First World War broke out in 1914, Goebbels was rejected for military service. Historians have speculated that many of his life choices in the years that followed were informed by being rejected to fight for his country during the struggle. Snubbed by the Imperial Army, he turned to scholarship and eventually received a PhD in German literature from the University of Heidelberg in 1922. Throughout his 20s and early 30s, he wrote several books and plays and worked in a range of different jobs. But he had little direction and began to flirt with the extremist politics of Germany as a result. It was in 1924 that he joined the Nazi Party. Rise to power. When Goebbels became a member of the Nazis, they had just gained notoriety for having attempted to overthrow the government of Munich and Bavaria in southern Germany early in 1923. Hitler was briefly imprisoned in 1924, and the party's activities were temporarily impeded by the government. However, by 1925, Hitler was free, and the Nazis decided to turn their attention towards trying to seize power through the ballot box rather than at the end of a rifle. They met with only limited success to begin with. For instance, they garnered just over 2.5% of the national vote in the 1928 Reichstag elections, which translated into only 12 seats in the 491-seat parliament. Goebbels was one of the 12 elected, and he entered the Reichstag as a Nazi member representing a district of the capital, Berlin. More broadly, he helped during these years to build a party apparatus up and was viewed as a pseudo-intellectual within the Nazi Party, someone who was responsible for a lot of how the Nazi propaganda and campaigning was undertaken. Soon all of this would bear fruit. After the Wall Street crash of the autumn of 1929 and the onset of the Great Depression, support for the Nazis ballooned in Germany. In fresh elections in 1930, they became the second largest party in the country with 18% of the vote, and then in July 1932 they won the election with nearly 2 out of every 5 Germans voting for them. Hence, early in 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, and Goebbels was appointed a few weeks later as Reichsminister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. Through this position, Goebbels in many ways became the architect of Nazism. Architect of Nazism. When it is said that Goebbels was the architect of Nazism, this means that he, more than anyone else, was responsible for shaping the ideological messaging of the Nazi movement and how it indoctrinated the German people in the 1930s. For instance, even before they claimed power in 1933, Goebbels was in charge of the Nazi newspapers that spread their ideas, and he was in charge of running their election campaigns. When we see photos today of Nazi party rallies with huge red and black banners bearing the Nazi swastika and other fascist symbolism, we are looking at propaganda that was the brainchild of Joseph Goebbels. After they claimed power, he was able to utilize the resources of the state to expand these propaganda efforts. The annual Nazi rallies at Nuremberg were choreographed by Goebbels and his staff in the propaganda department. He made expert use of the emerging medium of film to promote Nazi ideology. Goebbels also exercised a monopoly control over the media in Germany, including its newspapers and the airwaves. Books which he believed contradicted elements of Nazi ideology were banned, and children were indoctrinated into Nazi ideas in schools using education curricula which Goebbels largely controlled. Hitler might have been the leader of Nazi Germany, but in many ways Goebbels was the figure who cemented Nazi control over the minds of the German people in the 1930s. Propaganda in a time of war. Germany invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939. It had already managed to annex Austria and Czechoslovakia without a military response from Britain and France. This latest invasion was too far for governments in London and Paris, and the Polish invasion triggered the commencement of the Second World War. Goebbels played a major role in the conflict even before it started. It was his department that directed a deluge of propaganda both within Germany and Austria in the 1930s to try and convince people that it was the sensible thing for the Austrians, who were ethnically German and spoke German, to unite into a greater Germany. Once the war began, he was responsible for galvanizing public sentiment behind the war effort within Germany and convincing ordinary Germans that the conflict would finally realize the destiny of the German people to avenge the humiliation of defeat in the First World War and dominate the continent going forward. Over the next 5.5 years, Germans would be bombarded with propaganda that demonized the Slavic people of Eastern Europe, the Jewish people, and groups like the British and French as the enemies of Nazism and the German people. Goebbels' propaganda machine consistently portrayed these groups as the aggressors who were trying to destroy Europe and Germany as the salvation of the continent. Later, after the Germans managed to conquer Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, and France in the late spring and early summer of 1940, he took over the media in these countries and extended his propaganda empire across Western Europe. At the height of the Third Reich, several months after the invasion of the Soviet Union began in June 1941, Goebbels' propaganda department was in charge of radio stations, cinemas, libraries, newspapers, and every other media instrument available from Bordeaux in France on the Atlantic coast all the way east to the cities of Minsk and Kiev in Eastern Europe. Total war. As the war developed, Goebbels emerged as Hitler's most zealous follower. He never questioned the cause, not even when the war turned against the Germans. This happened as the German army failed to conquer the Soviet Union in the winter of 1941, and the United States entered the Second World War after the attack on Pearl Harbor. 1942 saw vicious combat on the Eastern Front before the Soviets began to start pushing the Germans back westwards. As this happened, a total war footing was adopted in Germany, where every citizen was expected to contribute to the war economy. Goebbels led the way on this, delivering a famous speech at the Sportpalast Stadium in Berlin on the 18th of February 1943, in which he roared at the crowd, asking them, "Are you and the German people willing to work if the Führer orders 10, 12, and if necessary 14 hours a day, and to give everything for victory? Do you want total war? If necessary, do you want a war more total and radical than anything that we can even imagine today?" He peppered his speech with anti-Semitic statements, which indicated his support for the Holocaust of Europe's Jews, which was just then playing out in the death camps of Poland. These and other events saw Goebbels rise in Hitler's estimation, even as other senior Nazi ministers like Hermann Göring, who had been Hitler's designated successor since 1933, fell in the eyes of the Führer. Succession and death. In the end, Göring was removed from the succession by Hitler in the final weeks of the war. He had learned that Göring and many others had contemplated negotiating surrender to the Allies, and this infuriated Hitler. For his part, Goebbels remained completely loyal to Hitler's cause. Still, he knew the war was doomed. In an article which he wrote early in 1945, he noted that an Iron Curtain was descending on Europe of Soviet rule as they conquered the Baltic states, Poland, and other regions. This term, Iron Curtain, would later be used by Winston Churchill to describe the Soviet control over Eastern Europe after the war. Despite his realization of the impending destruction of the Third Reich as the Soviet Red Army advanced on Berlin, Goebbels continued to adhere to Hitler's orders. It was for this reason that he was chosen to succeed as leader of the Third Reich when Hitler took his own life in the bunker of the Reich Chancellery on the 30th of April 1945. Goebbels would not last long. A day later, he and his wife Magda Goebbels poisoned their own children before taking their own lives. The Third Reich came to an end as what remained of the Nazi government surrendered a week later. Conclusion. Today, Joseph Goebbels is viewed by historians as being one of the ideological driving forces behind Nazism. He was the architect of much of how the regime looked and how it indoctrinated ordinary Germans into believing in the very idea of Nazism. We also have an unusually large insight into his mind, as Goebbels kept a personal diary which he began in 1923, shortly before he joined the Nazi movement, and which he maintained for over 20 years, down to the time of his death. Through this and many other sources, the story of the man who was leader of Nazi Germany for just one day at the end of the Second World War is revealed.